Hello, everybody. So here we go. This lecture will kind of be an appendix to that big, long three-part lecture that we had on curve sketching and how to actually graph functions. So basically, now that we've talked about these things like inflection points and critical points and first derivatives and second derivatives and all that good stuff, we can sort of go with a business topic here, and that's going to be the law of diminishing returns as well as just a little bit on the law of negative returns. So this should be fairly quick, just kind of like I said, just a little addendum, little appendix to the to that big lecture on curve sketching. So no curve sketching here. Just we're going to talk about inflection points and critical points here. So let's say that I have a revenue function here in the red. So we're looking at this business concept. I produce some quantity of a good given by X, and I have some revenue based on the amount of that good that I produce. And what you could actually sort of think about is that if well, obviously, if you don't produce anything, then you're gonna X is gonna be zero. You're not gonna make any money if you don't produce any of your good, if you don't produce any items. Um, and then as you start to produce more and more of your good, you're gonna start making money here. And the amount of money that you make is gonna increase based on the more you make, right? The more you make, presumably the more you sell, and so the more revenue you make. But at a certain point up here, all of a sudden it's almost like you're making too many of them. We could even talk about supply and demand, or you could say, hey, maybe I'm making so much of this that there's just not enough demand out there for whatever my good is. And so at that point, your revenue will start to drop off. Um, and if your revenue is dropping off right there, then obviously that's bad. You want to make money, and you don't want to be making more than you need to. In this region here, you'd probably have high costs. Your profit probably wouldn't be that good, but really it's just because you're making so much of them, of whatever good we're talking about, your revenue will decrease. And obviously down here, now you're just making way too much. If you're producing more than C units, then you're just going to be making negative revenue. It's actually going to be costing you more money to make your good than you would actually even get from the revenue that what you'd get from actually selling it. So most revenue functions actually have this kind of general shape to them, and so that actually gives us this sort of two different laws that we can talk about. That's going to be the law of diminishing returns and the law of negative returns. And I want to start off with the law of negative returns. I'm going to focus on this b coordinate right here. So I've got b comma f of b right there. And what we're seeing here at this particular point, we are seeing that my revenue starts to decrease. And I kind of explained that a little bit already, but just to go a little bit more in depth into that, as you produce more of your good, your revenue starts to decrease. And what we're saying is that in this stage, let's do that in a different color here. In this stage of the revenue function, my return is going to be negative. And what I mean by return is just that for every extra good that I produce, as I produce one more and then one more and then one more and then one more and then one more, and I keep doing that, every time I do that, I actually am decreasing the amount of money that I'm making overall. So my return is decreasing, right? The return on that product, that extra good, that extra unit that I'm producing, the return on that is negative, and that's not a good thing. Obviously, we want to try and maximize revenue as much as we can. So really, being right up top here, that's the perfect spot. Anything past that, my return is negative and my revenue starts to decrease. And so what we'll say here is that the law of negative returns occurs right after you have your critical point on your function. And so we should be able to see very, very clearly here. We've talked about we've talked a lot about critical points and what they mean. We've got a nice tangent line right there that has a slope f prime of b is equal to 0, b being that x coordinate. And so that right there sort of indicates when my returns start to be negative. And so basically, the law of negative returns just says that, hey, the point at which your returns become negative is at the critical point of the revenue function. And you can see that based on this graph right here. Right when we hit that critical point, I start to go down. I'm increasing, but then I hit that critical point and I start to go down and my returns are negative. And so there we go. That's the law of negative returns. Just tells us what happens when we reach a critical point on the revenue function. We're not going to focus so much on that because that's generally a pretty obvious trend in a sort of a business world, in the business sense. If you produce too many of your good, you start losing money. It's pretty easy to figure out where that is if you're a business, if you're a company. It's pretty simple to find that point. What's a little bit more complicated is this law of diminishing returns. And it's not much more complicated in how we're going to deal with it, but in terms of figuring out where this point is in a real world business application sense, that's a lot tougher. So let's go ahead and just give ourselves a clean slate graph here. So coming back here, actually, I'll blank out. This is just the law of negative returns, what I have right there. Boom, there we go. And now let's just look at law of diminishing returns. So we've already talked about negative. And I'm going to focus on this x coordinate that's A, that I'm calling A right there. And so the thing that I notice here is actually that my concavity changes at A, right at that point right there. I go from smiling, right? I've got that smiley face, if you will, which indicates concave up. And then right at that A, it switches to concave down, right? I've got that frowny face right there, and that indicates concave down. So I'm seeing a concavity change right at A. And as we've seen, the concavity will change when f double prime is equal to 0, not necessarily the other way around. So be careful there. But this inflection point occurs because the concavity changes, but it definitely will have f double prime be equal to 0. And so we'll go ahead and indicate that right here. F double prime of A is equal to 0. And the thing that I really want to point out here is focusing on this section of the graph and sort of why we care about this idea of diminishing returns. And so in this section of the graph, there are two things that I want to note. I want to take note of whether my revenue is increasing or decreasing. That should be pretty obvious. The revenue is increasing. In this section, in this blue highlighted section of the function, my revenue is going up, right? As my x gets larger, my revenue increases. So this part is definitely increasing. But now here's the second thing that I want to focus on. I want to focus on the rate at which this is increasing. And that sounds a little weird, but basically here's what I'm saying. I want to look at the tangent lines of this, and I want to say, hey, are those tangent lines increasing or decreasing? And really what I'm saying here is, if I were to take this function right here and I were to graph the derivative, I want to know if the derivative is increasing, which basically asks, hey, is the second derivative positive or negative? We've seen before that if we go from, let's go ahead and write this out. If we have f of x, f prime of x, and f double prime of x, we've seen this sort of backwards connection, if you will, where let's say this, like f of x increasing, f of x positive means f of x is increasing. So if f prime is positive, then f is increasing. And then we've seen that if f double prime is positive, that means that f is concave up. But what we could also say here, it sort of ignore these primes and all that. Let's just say that this was my function. This is one derivative of it, one more derivative going down. So what I could alternatively say is that f double prime positive means that f prime is increasing. And so basically what I'm writing here in the pink is exactly what I wrote here, but it's just one more derivative higher, if you will. And so really, so what I'm getting at here is this sort of second thing that I want to really make note on this blue section right there. I want to look at whether the slope of this blue section is increasing or decreasing. And so that's just me saying, I want to look at the derivative of this, and I want to say, hey, is that increasing? Well, all that says is, what's the second derivative? And like we said, this is concave down. So the second derivative is negative, which means that the first derivative is decreasing. And so you could alternatively say that, that, hey, that first derivative is decreasing. You could just look at the slopes of these tangent lines that I draw. And it's very clear that those slopes get smaller and smaller until they just level out to zero. And so what we're seeing here, this diminishing returns, is that, yes, our revenue is increasing. It's going up. But the amount that it goes up on each iteration that I move, on each unit that I produce, the amount that it increases by decreases. So every time that level of increase gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So I might start with a big jump, and then I have a slightly smaller jump. And then it kind of gets to the point where it's just these really small jumps, almost like a bouncing ball, right? That first bounce, it's going to go really high, and then it's going to keep sort of losing that energy, and it's going to just die off. And that's what we're seeing here. My revenue increases in this section, but the rate at which that revenue increases decreases. And that's what we want with diminishing returns. That's saying that the return that I'm getting for each good diminishes. It gets smaller and smaller for each good that I produce in this region A to B. Once I hit B, obviously we get into that negative returns that we already talked about. But that's the law of diminishing returns. It basically tells us that this point A is the point of diminishing returns, and that point of diminishing returns is the inflection point of that revenue function. And so just another way to say this, I like to say, hey, at that inflection point, the revenue gained from producing another unit tapers off. That's kind of my jargon there. Yes, the revenue increases, but the rate at which it increases gets smaller and smaller. So I don't increase as much for each unit extra that I produce. That's the law of diminishing returns. Point of diminishing returns, I could basically just ask you a question where I say, hey, here's a revenue function, find the point of diminishing returns. And you just have to find the inflection point of the function. And that's it. So there we go. That's our short little addendum to our curve sketching and inflection points and relative extrema and all of that. So there we go. We'll call that the lecture.